This is from Marcia Angel in 2009. She says, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." So for those of you that don't know, the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. Normally I'd be like, hey, I'm going to wing it, and I can just cover all this stuff, but there's no way I can wing this, so we are definitely... Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, all right. Yeah, maybe we could do like a hand signal thing. Yeah. This is part of that AI dystopian future we just heard about. All right, so you can go to the next slide when you can. All right, here we go. So the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. Could you? Here, can we do like I'm going to do like pow. Okay, yeah, pow. All right. So this is a quote by Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet 10 years ago. If you don't know, The Lancet is the most prestigious medical journal in the entire world. So what's going on here? A lot of people are talking about the fact that our institutions are in bad shape, and they are. This is true. They're corrupted, they're biased, they're bloated, they've become politicized. So that makes these quotes even more startling because you think, okay, if these are the journal editors of the most prestigious sort who are saying this now, how bad must it really be? So it's tempting to say, okay, it's just the social sciences though, right? Like we're all familiar with that idea, oh, it's gender studies, yeah, academia's kind of crazy, but it's like, it's those crazy underwater basket weaving people, and it doesn't really affect the natural sciences so much. And I'm going to go through many examples, or try to go through many examples to show why that is not the case. That's funny. I've got hand gestures like this, and so that's all right. We'll make it work. We'll make it work. So the other thing I want to say is this is not new. It's also very tempting to say, oh, okay, this is something that's new that's happened maybe since Obama got in office. Because you'll hear good thinkers, academics say, oh, you know, when I was in college in the 1980s, things weren't so bad. But that is not the way it appears to me. It reminds me of when people talk about like the 1970s and the news media. They'll say things like, oh, you know, the news was trustworthy back in the 70s. We had Walter Cronkite, and he was telling us the truth. I'm glad that was a laugh line. And I think what's more likely going on is that we didn't have alternative information sources. So the reason Walter Cronkite seemed like he was trustworthy is because you couldn't hear the dissidents. And I'm going to suggest this is actually going on in academia, and it's going in our scientific institutions, that we thought, perhaps, wow, science is totally rigorous, and like the methods of science are extraordinary. And then I'm going to say, based on the internet, the invention that has allowed dissidents to keep talking with one another and not be silenced, the existing paradigms don't look so good. And it might not be that we're living in a time of great enlightenment, but rather one of potentially darkness. So I want to, can you go back to that last slide? So I'm going to try to give you the big picture as best I can, and then I'm going to fill in some of the details, and it's going to be a blast, okay? The big picture is this. It seems like across essentially every domain that I've researched, which is many at this point, there was a lot of intellectual upheaval that was happening over the course of roughly 1870 to 1950. Okay, this, in physics, for example, you had the development of general relativity and quantum mechanics. In mathematics, you had a foundational crisis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You had the establishment of new paradigms of thinking about how mathematics works. In biology, you had the more general acceptance of germ theory, the widespread acceptance of Darwin's theory. In other domains, you see the same pattern, that this seems to be this time period of roughly 1870 to roughly 1950. There's a bunch of exciting, revolutionary things happening, and then I believe what happened is the paradigms we live under today were established back then. And let me give you an analogy. So it's very common to talk about the geopolitical paradigms that we live in as being established at the end of World War II. We talk about the Bretton Woods system, right? The US dollar is going to be the world's reserve currency. We're going to be the global police. And I think a lot of people would agree, yeah, sort of the international order was established at the end of World War II. And it might be the case that essentially the same thing is happening with our intellectual paradigms. They were established at around the same time. Part of the reason, at least, is because of the massive intervention of the state into scientific production. And everybody here knows that when the state gets involved, whatever they're getting involved in turns to crap. And there has never been in history a larger subsidization of scientific research than there was at the end of World War II. The reason for this is because science became an issue of national security. So when you think of what happened with the dropping of the atomic bombs, that's politically relevant, which means science is now politically relevant. Okay. So what I'm going to try to do is avoid something called Gell-Mann amnesia. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with Gell-Mann amnesia, but I'm going to give you the quote of what Gell-Mann amnesia is by the gentleman who coined it, Michael Crichton. He says, briefly stated, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is as follows. You open up the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. In Murray Gell-Mann's case, physics, or in mine, show business. You read the article and see that the journalist has absolutely no understanding of the facts of the issues. Often the article is so wrong, it actually presents the story backwards, reversing cause and effect. I call these the wet streets cause rain stories, and the paper's full of them. In any case, you read with exasperation or amusement the multiple errors in a story, and then turn the page to national or international affairs and read the rest of the newspaper as if it was somehow more accurate about what's happening in the Middle East than the baloney you just read. You turn the page and forget what you know, and this is the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. I'm going to say the same thing is happening actually with science. So I remember growing up, it was like a running joke to talk about whether or not butter or eggs were good for you or bad for you. It was like, butter's good for you, and the scientists say. And then 2 years later, butter's actually bad for you. And then 2 years later, no, butter is a superfood, it turns out. And 2 years later, oh no, it's terrible, and you're shortening your lifespan. Maybe that's not an isolated thing. It is funny, but maybe that's not an isolated thing. I think we should keep track. Another example of this, you guys probably are very familiar with alternative economic histories. So here's a question. Did FDR get us out of the Great Depression? No, exactly. He made it worse, okay? It turns out the story is inverted from what the orthodox story is. All right, so my claim is that, well, what if what's going on here is we've actually been living in a dark age? Okay? And by a dark age, I want to be clear, I'm not saying all the beliefs are false that we have inherited. It's way worse than that, because that would actually be easy. If everything was just wrong and you could invert it, you'd be like, okay, whatever the television says, I'm going to do the opposite and I'll be healthy. But it's way worse than that. What I mean is that at every single level in a theory of knowledge, there are errors, but you can't predict beforehand where they're going to be. So you have trivial periphery errors that don't matter so much, and you have enormous paradigmatic errors that matter a great deal. So the result is you kind of can't trust what you're reading in a textbook. You can't trust the experts because speckled throughout all of our official structures of knowledge are errors. And like I said, I think these paradigms were formed that we live under from roughly 1870 to roughly 1950. There's going to be plenty of exceptions. All right. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to just briefly tell you what I'm doing. I'm in the process right now of starting a new research institute. It's called the Natural Philosophy Institute, and it's preposterously ambitious, and I can't tell you all the things that I want to do because you wouldn't believe me. It's ridiculous. I have no business trying to achieve the things that I want to achieve with this institute. But one of the projects we're doing right now in the short term is called the Dark Age Research Project. And what it's going to be right now, this is a screenshot of what I'm calling the Research Hub in the Dark Age Research Project. And I'm trying to categorize, actually, take stock of the errors in the knowledge that we've received over the course of the 20th century. And the idea is we go broad and then we go deep. So this is one of the, when you go to the Dark Age Research Project, there's about 10 more big topics that are there that you can't see, and then you can go to the next slide. And in each one of those sections, we have specific articles. So this is the health and medicine section. This is the one that's most built out so far. And for each one of these ideas, the amyloid beta scandal we'll talk a little bit about. Right now, it's mainly just me working with the AI to generate little stubs of articles. So this is not, this is very early stages. But we're going to essentially try to build out a heterodox Wikipedia. I'm trying to be rigorous with this, and somebody needs to do this. Like, what are the terrible ideas? It should be less controversial by the year to say, we inherited terrible ideas, we're operating within shoddy paradigms, our institutions are feeling, okay, what do we do about that? Well, this is one attempt to do that. Next slide. Okay, and the way, if you're interested in this, the way that you can get access to it, we're calling it the NatFi network right now. And a little bit of my history is I was in the nonprofit world for some years, and I found bad incentives, among other things, in the nonprofit world. There's a place for nonprofits. I'm trying right now to see if I can build this not as a nonprofit. We'll see if it works. But you can join. It's like a paid subscription model. And you can join. Right now, this is a screenshot of the social network you get access to. And you also get access to the Research Hub. The hope is that as the network grows, people will be able to share the research that they have with us so we can add it to that, the research project that I showed you, and then we can do some real analysis on it. Okay, so that's the big picture. And now I want to have a lot of fun and go through a bunch of different topics in a careful way, but I can't really do deep dives on any of these because we don't have time. It's a hard case to make that you just, you go on stage and go, we're living in a dark age, just take my word for it. It's a very difficult case to make. So what I'm going to try to do is say, here's several examples of really big problems with existing paradigms, and a possible explanation for what's going on is that we're in a dark age. That's a much easier case to make. Oh, 1 second, sorry. So we're gonna zip through the replication crisis, a couple of topics in medical science. The lipid hypothesis, you guys might be familiar with. We're going to talk about the amyloid scandal in Alzheimer's research. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about biology and cell line contamination, and I'm going to violate every rule of public speaking. And there's an article that has been written that's fantastic, and I'm going to quote it for like 300 words, okay? And we're going to work through some of the claims that this biologist makes, and you'll be disturbed by it. In fact, funny story. I was trying to print off my notes this morning, and I got some bad information about who could print my notes off. You think it wouldn't be that difficult to just print some notes. And so, long story short, I wound up going to a separate hotel from the one that I booked. And they said, yeah, we can print them off for you. And the lady behind the desk, she said, oh, wow, this is fascinating. I've got a background in biology. This is amazing. I never heard this about what's going on with a cell line contamination. So that's a good, tantalizing thing, right? The lady at the hotel checking me in was like, wow, this is amazing. Please tell me more. So we had a good conversation about it. And this is not going to be speculation so much as we can see there's a bit of rigor behind all of this. All right, then we're going to zip over to archaeology. We're going to talk about a couple things in physics. Don't worry, it's not going to be super technical. And then if we have time, I'm going to tell you about the most heretical concepts and domain that one can be skeptical of, and that's what's going on in mathematics. It's a pet subject of mine for many years. It's made a lot of people upset over the years, but I want to tell you why I think it's actually very important to understand the circumstance that we're in. All right, let's go. Go ahead, you can just, do it again. All right, so you guys have probably heard of the reproducibility crisis, perhaps not. The summarized explanation is that in psychology, some years ago, researchers got this crazy idea, and they said, I wonder if we can try to reproduce a bunch of the results in psychology that have been made popular over the last so many years. And they found, oh no, we can't reproduce a bunch of the results, more than 50% of the results, in fact, in psychology. This is a systematic problem in psychology. It was coined the replication crisis. But it turns out it's not actually exclusive to psychology. There's now replication crises going on in essentially every domain. So I want to just give you this little quote here at the bottom. This is from an article written, I believe this one's in Nature. It says, more than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. Go ahead, next slide. She continues, data on how much of the scientific literature is reproducible are rare and generally bleak. The best-known analyses from psychology and cancer biology found rates of around 40% and 10%, respectively. Our survey respondents were more optimistic. 73% said they think at least half of the papers in their field can be trusted, with physicists and chemists generally showing the most confidence. So let me say one part again. Okay. They found that rates of around 40% reproducibility in psychology and 10% in cancer biology. That means in this particular research, 1 in 10 cancer biological papers were able to be reproduced that they looked at. Now, there are other people trying to research this, and there are estimates in cancer biology anywhere from 10% to 40%. That's really bad, and we're going to have a bit of an explanation maybe for what's going on when we're talking about the cell lines in biology. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about the lipid hypothesis, but it just reminded me. At the end of that quote, I don't know if you noticed, it said the physicists and the chemists are more optimistic. And yet, if you were to Google later, replication crisis in chemistry, you'll see a bunch of literature of chemists going, uh-oh. Looks like we have a reproducibility problem ourselves. In chemistry, this is one of the hardest sciences there is, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the lipid hypothesis you guys are probably familiar with. Let me catch up here. All right, so what the lipid hypothesis is has actually changed in recent years, but I'm going to give you the original idea and then share why the lipid hypothesis is maybe on shaky grounds. So the original claim was something like, depending on how you want to phrase it, saturated fat intake contributes to heart disease. I think that's a fair summary of this. All right? There were early observations of this going back to this critical time period from 1900 and 1930. But the real proponent of this theory is a guy named Ancel Keys. And Ancel Keys, in the 50s, presented this lipid hypothesis, famously to a conference in Zurich or Geneva, Switzerland in 1955. Talking to the WHO, would you believe it? About 20, at that time, or shortly after that time, he took on a research project called the Seven Keys Study, or the Seven Country Study, which was then published in the 70s. And go back one slide. Yeah, I don't want to give away the punchline here. So the Seven Keys Study was trying to show empirical evidence for the lipid hypothesis. And it has been criticized many, many different ways over the years. One of the criticisms is that there was just blatant cherry picking going on of the data. And okay, now you can go to the next slide here. All right, so I just want to show the study is still being criticized today. All right, this is from 2024. The title of the paper says, "The Lipid Heart Hypothesis and the Keys Equation defined the dietary guidelines but ignored the impact of trans fat and high linoleic acid consumption." Next slide. So let me quote this for you. This is rich. She says, "The Keys equation conflated natural saturated fat and industrial trans fat into a single parameter and considered only linoleic acid as the polyunsaturated fat. This ignored the widespread consumption of trans fat and its effects on blood cholesterol and promoted an imbalance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the diet. Numerous observational, epidemiological, interventional, and autopsy studies have failed to validate the Keys equation and the lipid heart hypothesis. Nevertheless, these have been the cornerstone of national and international dietary guidelines which have focused disproportionately on heart disease and much less so on cancer and metabolic disorders, which have steadily increased since the adoption of this hypothesis." All right, next slide. That's fun, right? Let's go to Alzheimer's research. A claim, the claim people might be familiar with is something along the lines of Alzheimer's is caused by plaque buildup in the brain. You might have heard some variation of that. So this plaque theory originated in the early 1900s with Mr. Alzheimer himself, and there has been observations going back a very long period of time on the brains of people who seem to have what we might call dementia, and then they die, and we look at their brain, there's these plaques in there, so what's going on? There was a specific plaque that was discovered in the 1980s, and people thought, okay, maybe we're getting close to the culprit here. Maybe this specific plaque is the one that's contributing to Alzheimer's. And then in 2006, there was a study that was published, a very famous one, one of the most cited in all Alzheimer's research, with mouse models that said, oh, look, we effectively genetically engineered some mice to produce this protein, or overproduce this protein, that results in plaque buildup in the brain. And then we saw symptoms of mental degeneration or brain degeneration. Okay, this was a seminal paper, as I said, and since then, there have been billions of dollars of research that have flowed into researching this specific plaque. And notably, if you guys know anything about what's going on in Alzheimer's, or unfortunately, if you have any familiarity with the industry or anybody suffering with it, you know, the medication doesn't work. Now, it does work to reduce plaque. That's something. But it doesn't actually seem to improve people's cognitive state. And maybe the reason for that is that we've got causality mixed up. If, for example, I don't know if this is true, but if, for example, the plaque is there because it's some kind of immunological response, then it wouldn't be that the plaque is causing the Alzheimer's. It's there because there's maybe some infection. Okay? This is one possibility. There's also, so this is a screenshot of the paper I'm referencing from 2006 that was seminal. Okay, now go to the next slide. Oops. Less than 1 year from today, so 2024, the paper was retracted. Why was it retracted? Because apparently there were photos, the images that were used appear to be fabricated or doctored or altered. Outright fraud. This was in Nature, by the way. This is the not just the most prestigious medical journal, but the most prestigious scientific journal in the world had to retract this. That's a problem. All right, next slide. All right. Oh, man. You guys are in for a treat. All right. So we're going to talk about a concept that is so disturbing that it blows my mind. I've read the article I'm going to quote from several times, and I'm like, this is extraordinary. How do people not know this? Even this biologist lady at the hotel didn't know this. How does nobody know this? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a bunch of quotes from an article written by a biologist named Jumi Kim. You might be familiar with her. I don't know. She's been on some shows. I think she was on Brett Weinstein's show a few times. And she's got a Substack, which is excellent. And as I was trying to summarize her work, I was like, I'm just going to quote it because it's well written and I can't really do a better job. So it's called, her Substack is called Let's Be Clear. And this is the article we're going to be quoting from. All right. So here we go. Cell lines. Cell lines are cultures of cells that were originally obtained from the tissue of a single individual and kept alive, usually in tubes or petri dishes. Some have been kept in culture for many decades. They're supposed to be a pure population of cells with minimal genetic variation, which is useful for generating consistent and reproducible results. The HEP2 cell line was first described in 1954 as laryngeal cancer cells, aka cancer cells of the larynx, your voice box. However, in 1966, Stan Gartler discovered that HEP2 cells were actually derived from contamination by cervical cancer cells from a cell line called HeLa, so named because they had come from a woman named Henrietta Lacks. Cervical means of the cervix, which is the lower part of the uterus in the female reproductive system. That is obviously a totally different kind of cell. Gartler published his results in 1968 in Nature. His findings were independently corroborated in 1988. However, it seems a lot of people didn't get the memo. A review from 2019 revealed that since 1954, roughly 1,000 out of 5,500 publications using HEP2 cells were still mistakenly referring to them as laryngeal. More recently, a study found in 2021, out of roughly 8,500 articles using HEP2 cell lines, 3,163 of them were still describing them as laryngeal. So let me pause here for a moment and explain the timeline here. 1954, this cell line is described. 14 years later, somebody publishes it and says, hang on a second, this is HeLa. This is a completely different cell. It takes 2 decades before that is independently corroborated. And almost 35 years later, more than a third of papers using the cells are describing them as the wrong type of cell. So I asked, does science self-correct? This is one of these fundamental concepts, right? Science self-corrects. Does it? Is that what it looks like? Okay, next slide. Why does this matter? Well, cells derived from different tissues look and behave differently. All kinds of things are different between different cells, different types of cancer cells, from their morphology, their gene expression, metabolisms, and even how they respond to different treatments. So the cell lines used in a study matter a great deal, as you might imagine. If you're studying laryngeal cancer, you'll want to use a laryngeal cancer line, not a cervical cancer line. Okay, even worse, the rates of publications misidentifying the HEP2 cell lines has increased in the past 3 decades. The red bars in this chart from the 2019 review show the annual number of articles referring to HEP2 cells as laryngeal in origin. So, you might ask yourself, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's just like a classification problem, some mislabeled thing. It's no big deal. So she continues. Next slide. In this chart, also from the 2019 review, the red columns represent the annual number of articles that misidentified the HEP2 cell lines where the laryngeal nature of the cells was directly relevant to the findings. In other words, If you're looking at the red bars here, you notice there's an uptick, okay? The red bars are papers that are published where researchers are using the cell line, and the fact that the cell is supposed to be laryngeal matters, and the rate's increasing. Next slide. Okay, she continues. Sorry, I just find this so funny. I feel like I'm sharing this dark, foreboding truth with everybody. It's just mind-blowing. Hep2 cells are far from the only cell lines that have been misidentified or contaminated. So here she says we've got two breast cancer cell lines. One turned out to be rat, the other was HeLa. We've got cells that are supposed to be cystic carcinoma, heart, skin, liver, eye, and amnion are all actually HeLa cells. Later on, she describes that other cells are also doing the contaminating. So we have umbilical cord cells that are actually bladder cancer cells. We've got one article, or one example we'll talk about in just a second, which is called MDA-MB435. It's a popular cell line for modeling breast cancer, referenced more than in 1,200 scientific studies, and it turns out to be, not breast cancer, but a male patient's melanoma. That is skin cancer. All right, next slide. So, how bad is this problem? Estimates vary, but a register of misidentified cell lines lists 531 cell lines that are known to be misidentified. This only lists cell lines where there is sufficient data to draw firm conclusions. Many cell lines are candidates awaiting review. National Testing Services reported that up to 36% of cell lines were incorrectly designated. So then we return to the question of how could it be that 10% of cancer biology studies are replicating? Well, I mean, perhaps it's because they don't know what cells they're looking at. Okay, next slide. I want to read you, so there's two more on cell lines that I want to read you. One of them is funny and one of them is not so funny. So this one I just find funny. I don't know if you guys have the same sense of humor, but it says, this is a paper from 2007 that says the MDA cell lines are derived from melanoma, and this is a loss for breast cancer but a boon for melanoma research. She says, the researcher says, all currently available stocks of MDA-435 are derived from a melanoma skin cell line and can no longer be considered a model of breast cancer. These cells are still a valuable system for the study of cancer metastasis, and the extensive literature using these cells since 1982 represent a valuable new resource for the melanoma research community. How's that for optimism, right? You want to be that person's friend. Like, okay, maybe we got the cells wrong, but like melanoma researchers made off on it. Great. Okay, next slide. This is from 2015. I want to illustrate the point here that this is not a problem that's going away somehow. 2015. It is a matter of significant concern that the articles which refer to MDA-435 cell line is a breast cancer cell line, and they are still being published in peer-reviewed journals of international repute, even in 2014. Questions have been raised for the last 14 years or so about its origin, and caution has been advised against using the cell line as a model for breast cancer. The origin of the cell line, notwithstanding a few contradictory reports, has been established to be of melanoma. All right, next slide. All right, now we're going to go to a completely different domain. We're going to talk about archaeology. Maybe you guys have heard of Göbekli Tepe. It's been on, Rogan's talked about it on his show. And I'll just give you, this is going to be much more brief. So Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site in Turkey. And it's a vast network of these structures that are huge stone pillars that are arranged in circles. And some of these pillars are I think the average is like 10 to 20 tons, some of them are up to 50 tons. And the weird part about Göbekli Tepe is that it's dated to at least 9600 BC. This is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. This is supposed to be, this site has only been excavated, I think, like 10%. So this is supposed to be before agriculture, before the domestication of cattle. This is supposed to have been built by hunter-gatherers. Go ahead, next slide. One way or another, Göbekli Tepe is going to force us to reevaluate our paradigms and the story that we tell about the history of humanity. So the gentleman who excavated the site has died, but his name is Klaus Schmidt, and he said, the story that we tell in human history is that we developed agriculture, and then we got permanent settlements out of agriculture, and then we got more complex civilization, and we get religion. We get things like religion, we get monumental architecture. But if Göbekli Tepe is dated correctly, then this doesn't match up with the orthodox timelines. And so he said, I think what's going on is actually first came the temple, then the city. So his idea was that, well, he thought maybe this was built by hunter-gatherers, and somehow the desire to build the temple, to do religious worship, was something that prompted the development of agriculture. So he kind of turned the timeline on its head. Now, I want to say just a couple more things on this, because he died, I think, about 10 years ago. And they're still excavating, and it's very interesting. And there is more evidence that the site wasn't developed by hunter-gatherers, but maybe our historical timelines for the development of humans is wrong. So if they had developed agriculture, well, then we also have to rewrite the textbooks, because it turns out civilization is older than we thought it was. Okay, next slide. How are we doing on time? Oh yeah, we're doing good. All right, we're gonna do some concepts in physics. This is just so much fun. So first we're going to talk about the cosmological axis of evil. Has anybody heard of this in here? Nobody? Oh, how delightful. Okay. I didn't make the term up, all right? So have you seen, maybe you guys have seen this image before. This is supposed to be the cosmic microwave background radiation. And it's described as the afterglow of the Big Bang. So it's like leftover radiation from the Big Bang. And this is one of the discovery of this was one of the reasons we wound up with the Big Bang model. This was like a confirmation of the Big Bang model. And there has been, just in recent years, the discovery of some bizarre data coming from our telescopes that I'm going to tell you about. So in cosmology and in physics, there are two principles that are related to one another. One of them is called the Copernican principle, which says that essentially our Earth is not in any kind of privileged position in the universe. We're not like at the center of the universe or anything like that. It's a very fundamental assumption. And the other is a little bit more technical. It's called the cosmological principle. And it essentially says, well, so the technical language is the universe is supposed to be, isometric and homogeneous. So isometric just meaning there's no orientation to the universe. So when you look at the universe, this direction looks the same as if you look at it that direction. And it being homogeneous is essentially just a claim that matter is evenly distributed everywhere on average. When you zoom out, that's what that means. Okay, but there's a problem. There's a couple of problems here. There is data that is coming now from multiple telescopes, which is suggesting that both of these fundamental axiomatic ideas could be wrong. You can't see it in this image, but the way that so what you're looking at is this is supposed to be little temperature gradients. So like the red spots are like 0.1 Kelvin or something, like tiny temperature differentials between the hot spots and the cold spots, okay? And it's supposed to be that because the universe is homogeneous, that when you zoom out, that's supposed to be random. And it kind of, the left half of it at least looks kind of random. Don't worry about the right half of it right now, because that doesn't look random, but it doesn't matter why that doesn't look random. So when you do a more sophisticated analysis of this apparent randomness, it turns out it doesn't look random. That these little dots seem to have an orientation to them. Okay? The analogy is to like paint. Imagine I have paint and I throw it on the ground. You look at the splatter and you could sort of infer where the paint came from, where the can came from, right? So these little dots appear to have some sort of consistent orientation to them, which is bizarre. The really bizarre part is that they seem to point to a plane. And the white line that you're looking at is it's supposed to represent what's called the ecliptic plane. Just I know that's a lot of terminology, but there's the sun, there's the earth. Earth revolves around the sun. Imagine that makes like a disk or a plane, okay? That's the ecliptic plane. And that white line is supposed to be connected to the ecliptic plane. Okay, well, it turns out that this orientation of the little temperature splotches is pointing towards our ecliptic plane. So in other words, there's an orientation in data that was supposed to be random, and one could describe that as saying maybe we're in the center of the universe. In other words, if you're trying to talk about objects in space, there's a meaningful way to say that, the objects above our plane and the objects below our plane, and that's corresponding to some objective patterns in the data. Now, if that's true, it's a wild idea that violates a whole bunch of assumptions, which is why they call it the cosmological axis of evil. And I don't know exactly what to make of this. I actually tend to be skeptical that we know exactly what the microwave background radiation is, but this data is in there. It's been verified by different teams across different data sets with different telescopes. So, again, you can just Google this, run down the rabbit hole of that one. All right, next slide. All right, I got 10 minutes here. I think we can do it. All right, so we're getting closer to what I think is some of the core paradigms that really have structured our thought for the last century. And you guys may have noticed that there's some weird connection between people making bad arguments and then referring to quantum physics. Have you had those conversations where somebody be like, yo, the reality is crazy and contradictory because quantum physics, man, and Schrodinger's cat's dead and alive, so there's no stable reality. There's a reason for that. There's actually a reason for that. And I think it's part of the reason that we're in a dark age right now. So just a tiny little bit of history. Let me drink a little water first. Here we go. Tiny little bit of history. In the early 1900s, there was the development of the new area of research in physics called quantum physics. Quantum just means really small scale. And they were discovering all kinds of amazing things, that the quantum world, a really small scale world, seems to behave in unexpected ways. And they were running into problems that can sort of be understood in the following way. So imagine I'm trying to figure out the temperature of a glass of water. And so I stick a thermometer in the glass of water. Well, it's true to say that at the very small scale, the thermometer being in the glass of water changes the temperature of the water, right? So is it possible that our measurement is somehow interacting with the thing that we're trying to measure? This turns out to be a really deep problem, and there are different schools of thought of trying to wrap your head around this and how to grapple with it. Is there such a thing as a pure measurement that doesn't disturb the thing that you're trying to measure, especially when you're talking fine-grained phenomena? So there's different schools of thought, and the one that wound up becoming dominant for decades is called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. I know that's a mouthful. But the general idea is this, that there is no way to meaningfully talk about the state of a quantum system outside of it being measured. The measurement itself forces reality to take a definite state. So that is to say that you can't talk about nature or reality being some way outside of our measuring of it. It's not hard to see how this can lead to claims like there is no such thing as a reality, or the mind, our observation, creates or generates reality. This idea originated, like I said, in the early 20th century, and a famous, a popular science, I should not even say popular science, an example of this bizarreness is in the case of Schrodinger's cat, which is also a funny story. So the idea of Schrodinger's cat, you've probably heard of, it's like a cat that's alive and dead at the same time, right? That doesn't make any sense. People will often appeal to Schrodinger's cat to try to say, wow, reality is wild and crazy, like Schrodinger's cat. What they don't realize is that the physicist Schrodinger came up with the famous thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat to demonstrate the absurdity of the Copenhagen interpretation. Schrodinger was making what's called an argumentum ad absurdum. He was trying to say, if you were right, then it would result in this paradox of this cat being in a superposition of being alive and dead at the same time, and that doesn't make any sense. And somehow, over the course of history, it's turned into, well, reality doesn't make any sense because Schrodinger's cat. It's like, you got that story backwards. So I don't want to go into like great detail here, but I just want to let you guys know there are alternative models. There always have been alternative models that don't take this extreme Copenhagen approach. One of them is called pilot wave theory. It doesn't matter what they are. There are good, reasonable physicists who disagree with the Copenhagen interpretation. We don't have to accept that reality is not, in fact, in a particular defined state outside of our measurement of it. All right, next slide. All right, and this is the thing that completely blew my mind when I think I figured this out several years ago now, and from what I can tell, this is the first domino that fell, okay? And we're going to call it the loss of certainty in mathematics, and that's similar to a book title that I recommend if you're interested in this subject. It's called Mathematics, the Loss of Certainty, by Morris Klein, who's a mathematician, who talks about some of the history here. He disagrees with what I'm going to say the conclusions are, but he does a good job documenting the history. Okay, so here's some questions for you. What are the foundations of mathematical truth? We go 2 + 2 = 4. Why? You could say, it's got to be that way. It's logical. Maybe it's grounded in logic. Maybe you say, that, well, it doesn't make any sense to talk about truth. Truth really isn't to be found in mathematics at all. Different ways you can try to answer this question. What is the grounding of mathematical truth? The historical answer was actually that math is grounded in Euclidean geometry, the geometry we learned in high school, okay, with planes and circles and the ruler and the compass. And there's a really fascinating reason why this is the case. The ancient Greeks thought that geometry was sort of the foundations for math for a really good reason, which if you're interested, ask me in the Q&A. I'd be happy to tell you that story. So for literally thousands of years, the assumed kind of theoretical underpinning, the real meat, the real truth in mathematics was coming from Euclidean geometry. And then something happened in the early, mid-19th century, which is the development for the first time of non-Euclidean geometries. So what was considered the stable foundation, how do we know truth? Well, there's so many things we don't know. At least we know some things about math, right? Math can't be wrong. Well, what are the foundations of math? It's Euclid, and then there's the development of non-Euclidean geometries. And in fact, the mathematicians that were doing this research, we have some of their letters, and they didn't even know what they were doing. They're like, I don't think this makes any sense. I don't know what I stumbled into here, but like we have created what appears to be a consistent non-Euclidean geometric model. Okay, what followed from that? Well, there was a formal foundational crisis in mathematics. I know that sounds crazy. Nobody's ever heard this before. Just Google foundational crisis in mathematics, and you'll see from the time period of roughly 1870 to 1945, people were trying to figure out where the heck does mathematical truth come because it ain't Euclid. And so you had different schools of thought that developed around this, and here's the problem, nobody won. You had like 3 different major schools that were trying to found mathematics, and nobody won. Now you couple this with the Copenhagen interpretation in physics, and the result is, in our world, we live with steep intellectual hierarchies, okay? And generally, when people are trying to justify their arguments, they'll appeal to who they think is authoritative and intelligent, and those, the scientists really know what's going on. Okay, The trouble is, during this time period, the physicists were saying reality doesn't exist in a state outside of our measurement and other ridiculous things. And the mathematicians were saying, actually, there's no truth or certainty to be found in math. So I think this is part of the intellectual paradigm that we have inherited today when people are very nihilistic and thinking, you can't know truth, it's impossible. As we learned from Schrodinger's cat, contradictions can exist. I actually think, to my complete shock, surprise, and horror, that the first dominoes that started to fall were in mathematics. All right, next slide. Just a couple more things I want to talk to you about, and then we'll do some Q&A. All right, so I'm just going to go over this very briefly. So here's a question, like, if we're in a dark age, if that's what's actually been going on, then where do we go from here? What work needs to be done? Well, this is what I'm trying to do at the Natural Philosophy Institute. And I think the domain that we have to fix most urgently is the philosophy of mathematics. Isn't that exciting? And we have to fix our understanding of statistics, because confusion about statistics comes up absolutely everywhere. Think back to COVID, right? People were like, you need to stay locked in your house indefinitely. Why? Because look, here's an exponential graph of infections, and don't you know how exponential functions work? It's like there's some weird latent appeal to the authoritative power of mathematics and what was going on in COVID. Some of the models that were built in England to justify lockdowns, the mathematical models coming from academics, were ultimately based in math. They were like SimCity simulations based in math and coding. And they said, oh, look, that's very authoritative. We have to lock down because these people know what they're talking about, and they're dealing with math. So there's a huge amount of work that has to be done to revisit the foundational crisis in math and try to sort all of this out. Okay, maybe we can know some things, like arithmetic has to be solid, right? I think it is solid. We need good theoretical foundations for why that's the case and how we can know it. The last thing I'll say is not that. The last thing I'll say is thank you very much for your attention, and I really I appreciate your indulging something I've been wanting to tell people for like 10 years. I'm on the hunt, and now this is the first time I've been able to share this research. So thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Do we have some time for questions?
We're happy to take some questions, if you'd like to line up at the microphone here.
So AI models with the very beginning part with the medical research. I do believe that AI actually could bring us out of this in some way.
Yeah, I think, so one of the things we're definitely doing with the Natural Philosophy Institute is trying to use AI to sort through this. Now, there's all kinds of risks with using AI to do research, but what it is exceptional at is giving you basic concepts that you might not have had access to before that you can then double check and research. I think that the next generation of scientific researchers are going to be like 50 times, 100 times more productive than the last generation of researchers. I think AI is going to be a big part of it.
So the actual question is, so Facebook took all the scientific papers and put it into an actual meta AI.
Yeah.
They shut it down because it wasn't going along with their theories.
Yeah.
Do you think that that is because of this dark age, that even though this is there, they put all this scientific data in there and it's not correlating with the rest of the quote normal stuff that we see every day today? Could that be?
I don't know the details of that situation, but it seems very plausible to me that specifically when you start poking around vaccine research, you're going to start saying things that they don't like. And this isn't like, there's a bunch of excellent dissident research in the literature, and it has been there for decades. Some of the quotes of people trying to research, for example, the DTP vaccine, would blow your mind, what they've been saying for decades. And so if you've got an AI model that's been trained on all the data and says, why don't we listen to the dissidents? What do they have to say? I imagine they're not going to like what's coming back from the model.
If it's truly trained on the data, then there's no reason for it to lie. So honestly, that would be one way to take your next steps.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. It's very interesting, very stimulating. I wanted to sort of put some ideas out there
Yeah.
and see what your response is
Yeah.
to them. My take is that you're totally correct that we're living in a dark age. My view is that we're living in a dark age politically.
Yeah.
And what I think we agree on is that there's cross-contamination and cross-influence between the political world and the scientific world and world of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what you're saying is that the corruption and the decline in the political world is causing corruption and decline in the scientific world. So that's one thing that I took from your talk. But what I wanted to ask you is, it's sort of a bleak outlook, because unless you are going to somehow overthrow the political systems, that corruption in the political systems are going to continue to corrupt the world of knowledge, the world of understanding. So do you have a plan for a political revolution, and otherwise, how are you going to fix things?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to say the relationship between science and government is very complex, very dirty. I wouldn't necessarily say it's all one way, that the corruption from politics just spills into science. I think there's two-way interaction there. In terms of what to do about it, I don't have any plans for a political revolution. I do think that the internet is unbelievably powerful. We're seeing narratives shatter all over the place in real time, year by year. So I think if we had a private research organization that's trying to actually do deep dives that can connect the public with excellent dissident researchers who can hear the other side of the story, I think that's very strong in breaking a lot of narratives. Like we saw that with COVID. Because of dissidents, prominent dissidents, we saw that the contrarian narratives really did have a voice that they wouldn't have had 40 years ago. So the best that I've come up with is I'm going to try to do it this way, and I'll throw my hat in the ring and see if I can do something about it. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Steve. Thanks a lot for your work. I know we've argued on the internet before, but that doesn't matter.
Okay.
I love what you're doing. My question is that I think you won't have any problem showing the contradictions in existing science, because showing that something is wrong is relatively easy. But replacing it by something that has consistently higher standards than the mess we're in, that's a challenge. Like finding, oh yes, look at something I can think something that's opposite. Well, yes, but you'll also find something opposite when the official science is right, for instance.
Yes.
Now you need to, so you can show the mess, but sort out the mess. What ideas do you have for sorting out the mess?
It's a very, very important idea, very, very important concept. And that's something that I think a lot of libertarians and dissidents miss, is that it's so much easier to criticize narratives because they're probably wrong, because the world is unbelievably complex. It's a completely different ballgame to try to propose an alternative theory as a replacement. It's way, 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 way harder. So that's going to be a slow process, and that's a way more ambitious. That's on the agenda, but we're talking way out there, because step one is, hey, maybe the existing paradigms are wrong. Step two would be, okay, maybe we can come up with something better. But I do want to say, I would caution anybody who is excited about this and thinks that this is correct, we've been living in a dark age. Don't just lob on to the next alternative theory that you hear, because this is a very common pattern that you go, oh, the existing paradigm is wrong, and therefore the guy that told me about it is going to tell me the truth. It's way harder than that. Okay, great question.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Okay, last three.
So I've been aware that the chief editors of JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, have been saying for decades that basically science has been garbage for a long time, but is unaware of all these other fields. It'd be very handy if you could publish a very short booklet to hand out to people. I mean, the website's great, but I'm more tactile, but it'd be great to kind of be able to hand it out to people to spark discussions.
Yeah.
And that would kind of solve the pay model issue too. But I'd love to have a book of your presentation, basically.
Great, cool, thank you. That's a great idea, and there is essentially a literally endless amount of content that can be created from this. So if this is correct, if this is 15% correct, like this is a tiny sliver of all the information that I would love to share. This is 15% correct. We can have indefinite content creation. We can have books. We can have podcasts. We can have documentaries. We can have Substack articles. Like this is very fertile for new thinkers to come in and try to clean up this mess. So yeah, definitely books are going to be part of it in the future.
Thanks. I love this stuff. I've been a fan of Stephen Jay Gould's work because it always makes me think about question the why I believe what I believe, and I think this is the same thing here. And I actually wanted to provide maybe a little bit of antidote to the gentleman who was commenting on how bleak and dark this is.
Yeah.
And I actually see this as being really hopeful, because I see this as this is evidence maybe that we are getting better at seeing our own mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And that's what science is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to debunk theories, and that maybe this is the start of our path out of the dark age,
Yes.
and that eventually we're going to shorten the timeline in between when we accept a flawed idea and then realize it's flawed and debunk it, and maybe we'll get to the point. Maybe after we abandon an economy that monetizes attention, and we maybe when we start to see scientific rigor and paying attention to methodology, maybe when methodology becomes sexy, maybe we'll shorten that gap to where we debunk the ideas before they ever become popularized. And so
The pre-bunking, huh?
I'm really excited to see where this goes.
Well, thank you. Yes, I actually completely agree with you. So I wrote an article called Our Present Dark Age a few years ago, and this is what prompted eventually doing the Brett Weinstein interview, which was very fun. And at the end of that article, I take the same position that I think we're actually getting out of it, just like with the corruption in the media, for example. Are we pessimistic about the fact that the media lies about everything? Okay, well, the fact of the matter is a whole lot of people are now aware that the media is lying about everything all the time, about every topic. So I do think that, yes, there is cause for optimism here. If we get this right and we're correct and the narrative is compelling, I definitely think we can push things in the right direction. Yes, last question.
Okay, so I'm cheating because I have 2 questions, so hopefully they'll be really quick.
Okay.
The first is that with the cell line mislabeling example, you made the comment that science is supposed to be self-correcting, and that it doesn't seem to be doing that. What do you think would be a timeline that you would find acceptable, or that you would give you optimism or hope to see a correction happen in?
Yeah. I don't have a specific timeline in mind in terms of the cycle of how long it takes to clear up this bad information. I'm going to say, less than 60 years would be good. There's something very powerful to the idea that science self-corrects. I believe there's a grain of truth to that, so long as the cycles are extremely large. And that means if science is wrong for 60 years about whether or not saturated fat is good for you, there's going to be a whole lot of misery and suffering caused when you're in the early part of that cycle. So maybe this is part of the self-correction process. Somebody wants to say, science does self-correct. Look, you just gave that presentation. Okay, but in the meantime, for multiple decades, people have been suffering because of it. So we just need to shorten the timeline. I don't know. I don't have a specific number. How short?
And then my second question, if I don't go completely blank, what was it?
That's all right.
I'll ask you later if I
Okay,
remember.
I'm going to be out back if you guys want to talk about this afterwards. I'd love to hear your question, and then anything else you guys have to say. Thank you.